we'll see in Mallory a time when the religion's really, a lot of it's been lost. Both the classical and the medieval period write long works, largely of poetry. In the classical period, they're called the epic. Epic, even now, is a synonym for something large or titanic or gigantic. And the poems are thousands and thousands of lines long, generally rhymed, almost always with a meter of some sort, partly for artistic reasons, and partly because, in both times, the Middle Ages and the classical times, poets made their money by traveling around and singing their poems and telling their stories. And in the classical period, you would go to the houses of the rich, and you were a poet, they would invite you in. Of course, they gave everybody hospitality. And basically, you sang for your supper. And then the owner of the house would reward you based on how important he was and how good you were. Same thing in the Middle Ages. You have the poets traveling around from castle to castle and singing their poetry and telling their stories and getting paid for that. When you've got to remember stories and poems that are thousands of lines long, it helps to have repetitions. That's where those traditional elements that we looked at earlier in the classical comes in. The Homeric epithets, using the same phrases to key yourself to where you are in the poem. And the same thing is true here. For the classical period, some of the classical epics are the Iliad and the Odyssey, which we have excerpts from, and the Aeneid. Over on the other side, the long poems in the Middle Ages are called the Romance, which is where Romanticism will later come from, and where our word romance comes from. It actually comes from Roman, which meant Roman, because one of the three types of stories that the storyteller told in the Middle Ages was what was called the matter of Rome. In other words, it was the Roman stories, but retold with a medieval focus to them. So that, as you'll see, love gets to be crucial instead of just being almost non-existent in the poem. And among those, we have Beowulf, the Song of Roland, and the Morte d'Arthur. And we look at the Morte d'Arthur, the death of Arthur. We'll also look at the Arthurian legend. And they deal really with the transition of the Middle Ages from a brutal, primitive society based on violence to one where that violence is sort of coming under some control. In other words, chivalry, which we'll take a look at in a second. One of the first things you'll notice on the classical epic is elevated style. The poet is talking about important things. He uses the best diction, the best language that he can, and the poems almost always start off with an appeal to the gods, usually to the muses, who are the goddesses in charge of the arts, especially there's three of them in charge of different types of poetry, to come down and possess the poet so he can do the best job he possibly can. So right away you're talking to the gods. So that uplifts things. On the other hand, in the medieval romance, you have the use of the grotesque. Descriptions which, remember, the Middle Ages doesn't shy away from anything, no matter how gross it is. And in fact, they like gross things because they're filled with sensation. And the more sensation, the more emotion, the more sensation, the better. So that when you have, for example, the descriptions in Beowulf of the... now, what you have in Beowulf is a monster, Grendel, who's been terrorizing this mead hall. There's a difference between the classical and the medieval culture. The center of classical life was the public forum, the open square, where people debated ideas and orators talked to the crowd and tried to sway people's opinions. And for the Middle Ages, it's the mead hall. The first thing a Viking wants to do when he gets some money in his hands, buy his own bar. And in the mead hall, there's not much intellectual argument. There's a lot of emotional ranting and raving, and there's a lot of fist fights. In fact, there's a lot of sword fights going on as well. It's not based on the intellect. It's based on emotions. Basically, the argument that a Viking, a Celt, would make if he stood up in the mead hall would be, I'm right because I can whip any man in the house. And then somebody else would get up and say, well, I killed 9 giants, and I killed 2 dragons, and I killed these 4 important warriors, so I think I can pretty much take you. And then the first person would say, well, I've killed 11 giants and 4 dragons, and I strangled all of them with my bare hands. I didn't even use a weapon, so take your best shot. And then it would usually degenerate into a fight, and the winner carried the argument. Didn't have much to do with the intellect. So anyway, you got this mead hall, and this monster, Grendel's been coming in and killing everybody and eating up the knights. And Beowulf, who's a great hero, and as you'll see in a second, there's a big difference in what hero means. He's come north to help his cousin. But it's not so much because he cares about his cousin. He just likes to kill things. He likes to fight with stuff, especially monsters. And he's killed all the monsters in the south. There's nothing left for him to kill. So when he hears his cousin's got a monster problem, he goes up there and decides he's going to fix it for him. Now, they're all supposed to be sleeping in the mead hall, and Grendel comes in. The demon delayed not, but quickly clutched the sleeping Thane in his swift assault, tore him in pieces, bit through the bones, gulped the blood and gobbled the flesh, greedily gorged on the lifeless corpse, the hands and the feet. Now when you got monsters chewing up people's feet and their hands, that's pretty gross, that's pretty grotesque. That's an example of the use of the grotesque. Even when Beowulf grabs hold of Grendel, you got a grotesque description. He sprang to his feet, clutched Grendel fast. Though fingers were cracking, the fiend pulling free. So there's even there's some description of pain and violence. Or when he tears the arm off Grendel. There Grendel suffered a grievous hurt, a wound in the shoulder, gaping and wide. Sinews snapped and bone joints broke. So you get this graphic description of things because it stirs up the senses, it stirs up the emotions. In fact, the very layout of it is meant to stir up the emotions. The rhythms of it are exciting. Even if you didn't understand any of the words, the way that the beat goes along in the poem will stir you up. Grendel came creeping, accursed of God, a murderous ravager, minded to snare, spoil of heroes in high-built hall. Storming the building, he burst the portal, though fastened of iron with fiendish strength, forced open the entrance in savage fury, and rushed in rage o'er the shining floor. You notice you have that repetition of initial consonant sounds. What's that called? Rushed in rage. Alliteration. And the alliteration is what ties it together. You got some S's in one line. You got spoils, heroes, high-built hall. Then you have storming, building, burst, and portal. Then fastened, fiendish, strength, that goes back to the S's. Rushed in rage, shining, goes back to the S's. And floor goes back to fiendish and fastened. So there are these repetitions that tie the whole poem together. And the rhythm is meant to, now the repetition of sounds works on your emotions. The whole poem is really aimed at the emotions. So that's a good example of the use of the grotesque in stirring up the emotions. Now, there's a difference between a heroic age and a chivalric age. The hero, you have heroes in the medieval romances as well. But what the Middle Ages meant by hero was much different than what the Greeks did. For the Middle Ages, the hero is the good guy. He represents good, just the way the villain represents evil. And in fact, all of this is based on a religion. It's all about Christianity. This isn't just a battle in Beowulf between a hero and a villain, or between a hero and a monster. It's a battle between good and evil. That monster isn't just a monster. Look what he's described as. First of all, he's accursed of God. Then he's called the shepherd of sins. Christ was the shepherd of virtue. He would flee to the darkness, the fellowship of devils. He's the foe, the enemy of God. He's a hell-thane, the prince of hell. He goes to the home of the fiends with grim delight as he warred with God. Well, who warred with God according to Christianity? Satan, the devil. This is the devil. He represents absolute evil. When Beowulf kills him, he doesn't get rid of some vermin. He doesn't get rid of a danger. Instead, he purged of evil the hall of Hrothgar. This is a battle between good and evil. The hero, the further you go into the Middle Ages, the more he is not only a representative of good, but more and more a representative of virtue. Now, Beowulf is early on, and all the hero had to do was be representative of God and good, and be strong and brave. Beowulf is strong and brave. He's not that much better than, say, Ulysses. Classical hero doesn't have to be good. Hero doesn't mean you're good. Hero means you're somebody special. Somebody the gods have singled out. Usually because you have some particular ability or some particular skill. But you're not necessarily, the gods don't pick you out because you're virtuous. All of the heroes in the classical tradition all have enormous flaws to them. For example, Hercules, the strongest man in the world. And he has these 7 labors that he has to perform. And he does tremendous feats of strength and courage. But he also gets drunk and murders his wife and his children with that big club that he kills his enemies with. Ulysses, who you read about, Odysseus. He's the king of Ithaca. He's called the wily Ulysses because he's so tricky. He's so sneaky. His gift is really the intellect. He's a clever guy. He lies just for practice. No matter what situation he's in, he's always got some scheme going on. He washes up on the shore of an island, and there are women there are bathing, and they're no threat to him at all. And yet he still doesn't tell them the truth. They take him in, they feed him, they clothe him, they treat him like a prince. He still doesn't tell them the truth. It's not till he's been there a long time and he's sure he can trust them that he tells them who he really is. And he's got plans all the time. For example, one of his favorite tricks is disguising himself as a fool or a beggar and sneaking into the enemy camp and gathering information there. So he's known for his trickiness. Now, the Middle Ages didn't admire trickiness. Among the Vikings, if you killed somebody, you could pay blood guilt. You could give his family some money, and if they said it was okay, then you could get off. But if you lied, if you broke an oath, if you swore to something and went back on it, then you were an outcast that everybody turned against. Ulysses would have been an outlaw and a villain in the Middle Ages. But to the classical period, he's somebody to look up to because he's such a great liar. And he's not a good person. He's married to Penelope, who it seems at least loves him. I mean, she's there at home. There are all these young men trying to seduce her and wanting to marry her, and she doesn't give in to any of them. How about Ulysses? How does he fare with temptation in his travels? Anybody know? He's always getting seduced, at least 3 different times. He gets seduced by somebody. Of course, it's not his fault. He was bewitched. Every husband reads that story and goes, he got away with that one? I was bewitched here. It wasn't really my fault. She cast a spell on me. But you notice the classical period is realistic. They don't expect the heroes to be perfect. They expect them to have big flaws. In the Middle Ages, the heroes, the further you go in, the more virtuous they're supposed to be. When we get to the Arthurian legend, Lancelot is the perfect knight. And it's not just because he's the strongest, it's because he's the best, he's the most virtuous, until he meets his great temptation in Guinevere, and everything begins to fall apart. Now, in a chivalric age, strength and courage aren't nearly as important. If you turn that sheet over, you'll see on the back the definition is chivalry. It's a social, moral, and religious code of the perfect knight. It's a way of civilizing the warriors, like Beowulf. I had said earlier, Beowulf wasn't a particularly good guy either. And you have to read between the lines to see that. First of all, he doesn't go help Hrothgar just because he's his cousin. It's because he wants some adventure. When he goes there, the plan is that... Why is it that nobody can kill Grendel, by the way?
Put a curse on all the swords.
Got a curse on all the swords. You notice it's magic. It's a supernatural is why nobody can kill him. So Beowulf has this brilliant idea that he will lay there among the other warriors as live bait. And when the monster comes and grabs him, he'll tear his head off. This is like WWF thinking. I'll just lay here when the monster comes, I'll grab on him. No problem. It's, as you'll see when we look at Ulysses, the intellect is not much involved here. This is not a good plan as far as I can see. He's supposed to be sleeping in the mead hall, waiting for Grendel to come. Put out the lights, everybody goes to sleep. Grendel comes, he grabs a guy and starts tearing him apart. Everybody's running around, screaming, they're lighting up the torches, trying to find out what's happening. The king comes in. Then there's a beat or two. A little while later, Beowulf comes in, and one step behind Beowulf is the queen. Where was Beowulf supposed to be sleeping? In the big hall with the knights. Why wasn't he there when Grendel came? Where was he?
With the queen.
With the queen. That's why she doesn't come in a step behind the king. She comes in a step behind Beowulf. This is not a nice guy. I'll come and kill your monster for you. Don't do any bed checks while I'm here. So he's not a particularly moral individual. Later on, you'll see Lancelot resists temptation with all of his strength. Beowulf doesn't seem to resist much of anything. He's basically out to kill stuff. Now, when chivalry comes in, you need to civilize your warriors because they become too dangerous by this time. Feudalism has come in. The church runs the world, but there's two big businesses in the world. One is the church, and the other is feudalism. And feudalism is based on warfare. It's all about knights, and it works this way. God gives the land to the king. And the king takes a big piece of the land and gives it to the big knights in return for military service and loyalty. They take their big piece of land and they give smaller pieces of it to smaller knights in return for loyalty and military service. Those knights break the land up further and give it to still smaller knights in return for loyalty and military service. Eventually, though, you get down to the level of knights who basically live in somebody else's castle and they work for room and board and a suit of armor. And they're all hoping to move up, because that's a good thing about feudalism. It's based on warfare. You get rewarded for your ability to fight, but a lot of people get killed off. So castles are coming empty all the time. And if you're a hero, you get a castle. You can move up through the hierarchy. The problem is that you got these guys, this is like, it's like this giant jock fraternity. You have guys who are real athletic. They are brought up to kill. That's what they do. And to fight. And they love it. They love to fight and they love to kill things. The problem is, if you don't find an enemy for them, they'll either kill one another or they start shooting at the peasants for sport. Now the peasants are worthless scum. They're property. They have no value in themselves, and they're part of they come with the land. When you inherit a piece of land, you get all the people on it, all the peasants. But if you go around killing the peasants off, there's nobody to bring in the harvest, and everybody starves. So you got to find some way to control these knights, and that's what chivalry does. First thing, Christianity is based as a theology largely on betrayal. The betrayal of God by Satan, the betrayal of God by Adam and Eve, the betrayal of Christ by Judas. So it focuses on faithfulness and fidelity. All knights, theoretically, are God's knights. They owe an allegiance to God first and then to the king. Now, as you'll see later, you don't have to fight. Well, you have to fight, but you don't have to win to be a good knight. If you come across a better knight than you, and he's basically kicking the stuffing out of you, you can surrender, and it's no shame. He's a better knight. That's okay. What you cannot do is take a backward step from evil. Because when you confront evil, you confront the enemies of God. And as God's soldier, you can't take a backward step. So there, even if you're outnumbered, even if you're certainly going to die, you've got to fight anyway. That's your loyalty to God. So you want to have knights take this oath so that they're faithful. And they can be controlled. Faithfulness to God, faithfulness to the king. Secondly, one of the most civilizing influences is always women. Problem before chivalry, and it's a big problem for women, and that is that they are basically just property. They're prizes for the knights. They have no rights in themselves. Women belong to the strongest guy around, and they don't get to say no. Beowulf-type Middle Ages knight foreplay is a matter of punching you a few times to get you in an agreeable mood. When chivalry comes in, you can't beat up on women anymore. Now, they become the weak. They have to be defended. And women are placed on a pedestal. And that's good for women because violence against women becomes a bad thing and it tends to drop off. But it's a bad thing because when you say women are weak and helpless and defenseless, you put them in the same class with children. So what happens to the attitude towards women's intelligence? It goes down. You treat them as intellectual as well as moral, spiritual, and physical weak ones. And basically having been put on that pedestal in the Middle Ages is something that women are just now, in our part of the world, beginning to overcome. It seemed like such a good trade-off for women not getting beat up anymore that being put on a pedestal didn't seem like such a bad thing. What you want is to get, now you'd like some of your knights to take the same 3 vows that the monks took. Chastity, obedience, and poverty. Now you can see why you would want as many knights as possible to take a vow of obedience. Obedience says you obey. If you're a monk, you obey whoever's above you in the hierarchy, and ultimately you're obeying God. Well, you want knights to obey. When you say, go charge that band of archers, you don't want the knight saying, they'll shoot holes in me. Are you crazy? I'll get killed doing that. You want them to just go where you tell them to go. So obedience is a good thing. Why do you want to have your knights take a vow of poverty? If you can.
So you don't raid our villages?
So they don't raid your villages. You don't want, being a knight is like owning your own tank. With the armor and the horse, and the armor on the horse, you weigh about 1,000 pounds. And one knight on horseback in an open field can scatter 50 men easily, just by plowing right through them. You don't want a guy with that kind of weaponry setting up as an outlaw. If you do, you got a real problem. Because now the only people who can possibly stand up against him are other knights, and if he's the best knight, then you have an even bigger problem. So if he takes a vow of poverty, you don't have to worry about him going into business, making money for himself. The knights did, some of their fighting had an economic motivation. For example, in the Arthurian legends, there's a guy named the Black Knight. And the Black Knight hangs out at the crossroads and he fights anybody who comes along. He doesn't hate them. In fact, if the Black Knight beats you and you're wounded, he'll nurse you back to health with his own hands. And when you're feeling good and strong again, he'll say, you want to fight again? And if you say, thank you, no, he'll say, well, okay, but if you see anybody that does want to fight, tell them where I am. Because now he lets you go, but he keeps your horse in armor. So when the knight's spotted, it's kind of like racing cars for pink slips. You lose your car. You lose your armor. So the black knight's got this huge pile of armor he can never actually wear, no matter how long he lives. And some of it doesn't even fit him. But it doesn't matter. It's trophies. Guys are like that. They bring back useless stuff. I mean, guys keep trophies. And they always have. It goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, and that's half the value. He can sell that armor if he wants. He's not entirely an outlaw, though. He hasn't gone around attacking peasants. He's not robbing rich merchants or anything. That's the guy you got to worry about, and a vow of poverty keeps him from doing that. Why would you want some of them, at least, to take a vow of chastity?
That one.
Yeah, they're not attacking women. Rape is a big problem. And you want to have knights that you want to put some control on that, because remember in the past, and any woman that attracted a knight, if he could take her away from somebody else, she was his. And there wasn't anything she could do about it, or anybody else could do about it if he was the toughest knight around. So you'd like some of those really tough knights to take a vow of chastity as well, so they're not going around taking everybody's wives away from them. That causes a lot of hard feelings. You don't want them all, though, taking those 3 vows. Why don't you want all of your knights taking a vow of chastity?
Some of them have to get married.
Some of them have to get married. You need more knights. War uses up a lot of them. So you want them to reproduce. But you don't want them getting married right away. Why not? How good a knight does a married man usually make? Not if he's fighting at home and defending wife and family, he makes a good one. But when you send him overseas, generally the attack is going on and he's hanging back going, I don't know, this is suicidal. And look, I got a wife and kids here. I don't think I'm going up that ladder. They're pouring boiling pitch down. They're throwing down rocks. They're shooting arrows. Nobody's made it up that ladder in the last 45 minutes. I don't think I'm going. You don't want that. So instead, you do want him to have a true love. You want him to identify one woman early on. That cuts way down on the rape and pillage. Because if he's got a true love, then he can't disgrace her by going and attacking other women. But you don't want him getting married to his true love right away because, again, married knights aren't usually as good as single knights. What you really want is a single knight. You want to motivate these young guys. So you encourage them to find their true love early. But you can't just marry your true love. You have to earn her. You have to prove worthy of her, and you do that by doing great deeds, by being a hero. Now, you found this woman that you really want, but the only way you can get close to her is to be a hero. You're waiting for a battle. When the battle comes, you're not hanging back saying, after you, you're throwing people out of the way to get up that ladder. So you can kill a few people at the top of the king's enemies and throw them off the battlements. You want to get to be a hero. Now, being a hero one time, will that get you your true love?
No.
No. I mean, a woman it would show you didn't think an awful lot of her if you only were a hero once for her. I mean, she'd feel pretty bad about herself. Well, you thought I'd want to marry you because you stormed one castle, you went up one ladder, you killed 2 Saracens? That's all I'm worth? Well, Sir Geoffrey's done 3 castles and he wants to marry me too. Boy, you got to get out and get on your 3rd or 4th castle now. So what that does is it motivates the young knights to do battle as often as possible and to put themselves in jeopardy every chance they get, to be heroic. And when they've done that enough times, then you let them marry their true love. Remember, you're the king. You get to decide who marries who. Then you let them marry, and you want them to have some sons because they're proven warriors. You still send them off to war because you need some cooler heads there. You don't want just a bunch of young guys who'll keep attacking a place that can't be taken. You need some older knights going, we'll starve them for a while. They'll weaken. A month or 2 from now, we'll go back up the ladder. It'll be a lot easier. So you want them to have to do these heroic deeds in order to win their true love. And what this also does for you is it gives you a traveling unpaid police force and justice system. Because when a knight can't find a war to go to be heroic, he goes on a quest. He travels around your country looking for trouble, looking for bad guys to kill. There's your unpaid police force. The knights gave justice. Now, if you were a knight and you had a beef with another knight, it was almost always settled by trial by combat. You fought, and the winner was the guy who was right. If you were too old to fight, or you were a woman, you could get a champion to fight for you. But it was really settled by a force of arms. If you were a knight, you'd have trial by combat. If you were a peasant and you believed you had been cheated or wronged by a knight, you could go to a higher knight for justice. But your odds in getting it were next to nothing. Because after all, you're a peasant, you're filthy scum. You would lie as easily as you would talk. So the knight would say, tell us your story, and then he would say to the knight, tell us your story, and then he would say, well, you're a knight, I know you wouldn't lie, and you're a peasant, you people lie all the time, so they would find in favor of the knights. You might get justice, though, if you had an argument with another peasant. Then you would go to a knight to get justice. But the knights, well, were the knights picked for their intelligence? No, they're picked for their emotions for the most part. Good fighters are people who get emotionally involved in the battle. So because they weren't really good thinkers, they couldn't really sort out the evidence, so as likely as not, a knight would order a trial by ordeal. For example, we don't know which of these two peasants is lying about who stole whose sheep. So what we're going to do is we're going to heat up a red-hot poker. They're going to tell their story again, and then we're going to put the hot poker on their tongue. And if they're telling the truth, it won't hurt them. And if they are, of course, it will. Now, the surprising thing is that worked all the time, or almost all the time. And it worked for a very good practical reason. If you're afraid, what happens to your saliva?
Increase.
Just the opposite. You get dry. Your mouth gets dry when you're afraid. So, if you believed you were telling the truth, and you believed that God wouldn't let anything happen to you if you were telling the truth, you have probably even more saliva than usual. And they put the thing on your tongue, and the saliva takes up the heat, and it sizzles a little bit, but you don't really get burned, and they take it back off. But if you're the guy who's lying, you're putting a dry tongue out there. And when they put that hot thing on a dry tongue, they got to step on your forehead to get it to rip it back off again. And we know who the liar is, and it almost always worked because the liar ran out of saliva. So you have this kind of justice system, probably at least as good as ours, traveling around the country, handing out justice, and getting rid of your bad guys. Because you're a soldier of God, if a knight goes bad, all the other knights have to turn against him. And no matter how strong you are, you're not stronger than all the other knights combined. And so it's a way of policing everything. Service to the weak. Now you can't kill the peasants for sport anymore. You have to take care of them because they're the weak and they need to be defended. And of course, women now are the weak, and women need to defend it, so you can't beat them up anymore. You notice that what was the measure of a hero, acts of courage and skill at arms, it's all the way down in number 4. Beowulf's Day, none of those first 3 matter. By the time you get to Song of Roland, chivalry's in, and being courageous and being skillful are down at number 4. And number 5, fairness. If you've got a knight going out giving out justice, you want him to be fair. Honesty, you don't want him to be taking bribes, because if nobody, it's like that with any justice system. If somebody can buy justice, nobody believes it. If nobody believes in it, who would bother following the law? Justice, of course, is what he has to give out. And finally, mercy. The reason you want knights to be merciful? Remember, the knights fight with each other at the drop of a hat. If they have to fight to the death, you're going to lose a lot of your best knights if they get into arguments with your number 1 knight. Because he's easily going to trash your number 20 knight and then your number 11 knight. So you have to put a mechanism in to keep that from happening. And the mechanism is that a knight has to grant mercy. And what that means is if your number 20 knight gets in a fight with your number 1 knight, by about knight, he can't just back away. He's got to fight the fight. But after he's taken a few wounds and he's gotten knocked down a couple times and he's bleeding fairly heavily, he can throw himself on his knees, wrap his arms around the knight, and ask for mercy. And the knight has to grant it. Unless it's one of those personal beefs. If the number 20 knight raped your wife and daughter and killed them both, he can ask for mercy all he wants. You're going to cut his head off when you're finished beating him up, no matter what he asks for. But otherwise, where it's just a matter of knights fighting, because that's what knights do, you don't have to have your best knight killing everybody off. So you want them to have mercy as well. So when we look at the heroes in the Middle Ages, they're virtuous people. The further we go into the Middle Ages, the more they follow a code of conduct. There's no code of conduct for the hero in the classical. All right, next week we're going to finish this up and do those classical, epic, and medieval romance, and then we're going to move on to neoclassical and metaphysical. So we will have the quiz on neoclassical metaphysical.